Good morning, everybody. Welcome, students, faculty, staff. I see some faculty and staff. Guests. I don't know if we have anybody from off the campus, but welcome. This morning, we're going to be looking at the crisis in the Ukraine. We put this panel discussion together in short notice, but we're fortunate enough to have some very high-powered talent here. We're going to look at the Ukrainian situation, past, present, and potentially future also, from different perspectives. Again, we're waiting for one of our panelists, but he's not going first, so I think we can get underway. I'll introduce each of the panelists as he comes up. I'm Dr. Francis Coan, the chairman of the Social Sciences Department and professor of history here at Tunxis. So the presenters will present. Each of them will go about 8 to 10 minutes, I hope. That's sort of my job to keep them on task. So we will have a substantial amount of time at the end for questions and comments. So if you have any questions as people are talking, jot down your question or your comment. All right, perfect timing. We're going to start with Dr. Robert Smith. He's Associate Professor of Life and Physical Sciences and co-chair of the Math and Sciences Department. He's going to give our man on the street report, kind of first-hand impressions of the Ukraine. He's traveled there recently a number of times. We'll start with Dr. Smith.
Thanks, Fran. I'll leave it to my colleagues to cover the economic and political and military aspects of this. My job is to give you the first-hand account because, I'm going to skip ahead to show you why I'm interested in this. Family. My wife is from Ukraine. Her family, most of them live in the city of Milewski, which is, I'll show you on the map where that is. It's in this part of the Western Ukraine. Her parents live in Moscow, just outside of Moscow. So she's got relatives on both sides of this issue. And I can tell you that as they watch the news, they're getting very different accounts of what's happening. Because, as you may know, most of the just about all of the TV stations in Russia are run by Kremlin, run by the government. There isn't a whole lot of independent news available in Russia, so her parents are hearing, you could call it propaganda if you want, coming out of the Kremlin. Whereas in Ukraine, there's a mix, and really, as you speak with different people, and I've talked with some of her friends in various parts of Ukraine, there's a big difference. You can tell almost instantly whether people have good internet access or not, because those who do can see all sides and know that there's a whole lot of gray areas. It's not black and white. There's not good guys and bad guys. There's everybody acting somewhat in their own self-interest, and unfortunately, this country is not that experienced in democracy. And the previous administration, the one that was overthrown, essentially what they did is they took all the tax money that was coming in. This is I'll give you the names here. The former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, his base of support is in the eastern part of the country, the blue area on this map. And generally the feel there is that among those folks is that their best economic interest is to maintain close ties to Russia, whereas in the western part, obviously out here, they favor what's called the Fatherland Party, and they look west. They with closer ties to the east. So I'll leave it to them, to my colleagues here, to cover that in more detail. I actually was there recently in January. We were taking a trip, and had an overnight stop in Kiev. And at this point, this was before the main violence. There was a brief skirmish in December where some students had gathered there because of a decision made by Viktor Yanukovych to sort of form closer economic ties with Russia. They sent in the police and cracked a few skulls back in December, and then that small gathering turned into a permanent settlement. Nice little village there. They set up barricades with all sorts of flammable things to burn in case the police came back. So this was like 4 in the morning, mind you. We were waiting for a train at the Kiev train station. We said, let's go see Maidan. They call it Maidan. It's Maidan Nezalezhnosti or Maidan Nezavisimosti, depending on whether you speak Ukrainian or Russian. And most people in Ukraine do, by the way. At least they understand both. So there's a lot of talk about this language divide in Ukraine. I've seen it firsthand. You talk to people in Russian, and they'll talk back to you in Ukrainian, and pretty much everyone there at least understands both. So that all this talk about, there's a big language divide. That's an artificial political contrivance. People trying to make the point that they want, because most people in Ukraine understand both. Here's more pictures of the barricades, and you can see it very well. All sorts of tires there, which they eventually, in February, when the Fierro, the special riot police came in, they lit all these on fire. There were camps out there. The people, certainly they're not the fascists that the Russian media would portray them as. These were, in the middle of the night, it was the hardcore folks who were there, who were living there in tents. And it's right downtown. If you can imagine, this is sort of the equivalent of the mall on Washington, D.C. So you can imagine all this happening with the presidential building and the Duma, the Verkhovna Rada, which is their equivalent of Congress, literally blocks away from this. So I took these photos, and we had no problems getting in. We drove up in a taxi and just walked out, and the guard there, the guards at the barricades, and they just took a look at us and said, they don't look like Russian spies, so let's let them in. We were carrying a bag, and they said, is there a bomb in there? And we said, no, so they just let us walk on in. They didn't even look in the bag. There was a concert going on. They had this stage set up. Let's see. And, it's a nice little village there. And then all heck broke loose when the riot police did move in, and the original sort of civil protest was mainly in the western part. This was back in February, and then when they did try to clear that square, this is not my photo. I was not there, thank goodness. When this photo was taken, this was in February when the police moved in and tried to clear it up. So the photos that I took, I was standing literally right here when I took those photos that you saw earlier a few minutes ago. The barricade's on fire there. Eventually, Yanukovych did leave of his own free will, although he claims that it was at gunpoint, and he fled to Russia, and there's a before and after. It's actually a really nice city to visit. Don't watch the news. And especially the western part of the country, I would highly recommend it. It's a wonderful place to visit when times are peaceful. And so, yeah. Which brings us then to Russia's involvement, and again, my colleagues can speak in more detail about this, but the driving force behind that is sort of this so-called ethnic divide, where you've got Crimea especially down there with a very large proportion of Russians and Russian speakers, native Russian speakers, which is actually, by the way, it was originally Muslim population there, and Stalin cleared them out in the 1950s and 60s. to set up a resort there. And most of the conflict that you see is in Donetsk and Luhansk, which are over here. Over the weekend, there was a really nasty incident in Odessa, which is another wonderful place to visit, by the way, if there's not a war going on. And then Crimea. So these are the areas in darker blue are where the conflict is happening right now. And here's the latest word on the street. As far as what you hear from folks on the ground there, they feel like they're at a football game and they're not playing, they're the football. And they're getting kicked around by Russia, who has troops massed at the border. There's also Russian troops over here in an area called Transnistria, and now Russian troops here in Crimea. So they feel surrounded. The younger folks obviously want to stay, keep the country united. The older folks, like her grandmother, they have a sort of sense of nostalgia about the old days back, the glory days of the Soviet Union and space program and all that stuff. And so they wouldn't mind so much if they became a part of Russia. So I guess I'll wait for questions. Sorry if I didn't.
Thank you. Next, we're going to turn it over to a little historical perspective. Professor Bob Brown, who's professor of history and English, is going to look at, and I've come up with these titles. They didn't really give me titles, so I'm inventing the titles. So you can tell me how well they fit the presentation. Communists and kulaks, Soviet policy in the Ukraine in the 1940s.
Well, I think that's pretty good from my perspective. But we'll have
Doing the best I can.
Yeah, we talked about everything except for titles when we met last week. By way of background, just a little for current events. What is happening now has evolved over a period of several months. As Dr. Smith indicated, there was a change in power. The pro-Russian leader was basically deposed. He fled to Russia. His place was taken by another leader who has wanted closer ties with the West, in particular with the European Union.
Excuse me?
Yes.
It's really difficult to hear you back here over the piano. Could you speak up, please?
Now we just have to find out where to turn it on. So, better? Hey, okay. And as I was saying, the tensions basically date from that time. Pro-Russian people in Crimea, the easternmost region of Ukraine, began to agitate. Russian troops eventually moved in. A referendum was held by the people in Crimea, the result of which was that Crimea stopped being a part of Ukraine and became a part of Russia. That's basically it. And now what we have is tension on the eastern regions of what is traditionally viewed as Ukraine, and a sort of perhaps a repetition of the same thing that happened there. That's just by way of a very brief introduction. And I am going to talk about the period, the 1930s, 1940s to a certain extent. And I want to put what's happening here in sort of a broader historical context. And I start by saying, if we realize that Russia was the heart of the former Soviet Union, which collapsed in the 1990s, we realize that the revolution which brought the communist government to power and led to the creation of the Soviet Union began in the Russian city of St. Petersburg, and that it took a civil war to bring Ukraine into the Soviet Union, then we can see that the latest flare-up does have deep historical roots, and it is very much related to the history of the Soviet Union. Simply put, what is happening today in and around Ukraine is but the most recent manifestation of tension and conflict between Ukraine and its larger, more powerful neighbor, Russia. An earlier engagement, arguably even more brutal, I think definitely even more brutal, occurred in the early 1930s. The government of what was then the Soviet Union, of which both Russia and Ukraine were a part, literally chose to starve the people of Ukraine in what has come to be called the Holodomor, which either means, depending on how you translate it, the Great Famine or the starving. The Encyclopedia Britannica estimates that between 5 and 5.5 million Ukrainians died during 1932 and 1933 as a result of a government-generated famine. These deaths ostensibly were the result of the Soviet attempt to change the Ukrainian agricultural economy. Ukraine is heavily agricultural, even more so at that point, from one based on individual initiative and private ownership. The landowners in Ukraine were referred to as the kulaks. It's the title of Dr. Coan assigned to me. To replace this system based on individual initiative and private ownership to one built around large state-run collective farms. Take the land away from the kulaks, force the kulaks to work on collective farms, and at least according to communist ideology, productivity should soar. Okay. In the process, however, the Soviet government not only starved millions, but also destroyed what had been the richest agricultural region in Eastern Europe, one of the richest in the entire world. The origins of the Holocaust lie in 1928, when the Soviet dictator, Holodomor I should say, lie in 1928, when the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin introduced a plan to force farmers to give up their private holdings, equipment, and livestock, and join those large state-owned collective farms. As I said, this is perfectly consistent with communist doctrine, both in its belief in large-scale economic organization and in its loathing of private ownership. Ultimately, though, and I think this is the next level down, it reflected also a desire to bring Ukraine under the control of the Russian-dominated central government. By and large, the prosperous Ukrainian farmers refused to join the collective farms. Joseph Stalin, Soviet leader, responded by branding these farmers as enemies of the working class. In a chilling preview of what is happening today, the government sent in regular troops and secret police to eliminate or remove the prosperous farmers who had resisted the collective movement. Between 1928 and 1930, families had their farms, livestock, and seed included seized by the government. An estimated 1 million Ukrainians were forced onto the collective farms. Another 500,000 were removed from Ukraine and sent to Siberia and other cold regions of Asia and Russia. The government next increased Ukraine's quota for what they had to produce, raised the amount of produce that they had to generate to be exported out of Ukraine to levels that they couldn't meet. For shipment out of the area and to the rest of the Soviet Union, they could not meet these quotas, which meant that the Soviet government simply took everything that they could, creating the circumstance in which millions of people would starve. And that is what happened. This was all a matter of deliberate policy planning. It wasn't reflective of the desire to control Ukraine as well as to impose this vision of collective agriculture. Joseph Stalin himself stated at one point that the national question is in essence a rural question. Now, you know, communist talk sometimes goes backwards. It requires a little bit of analysis to figure out what they're really saying. But what he's saying is there is a problem that the Russian-controlled central government has to deal with. And that's that there are a lot of different population groupings, ethnic groups, in the Soviet Union. Ukrainians are one. And typically, these ethnic groupings are rooted to the land. They're farmers, they're agriculturalists. So if you deal with their problem, if you take the land away from them, then you're dealing with the problem of all those ethnic nationalities. And over and over again, you'll see the Soviets doing this. In Ukraine, they moved people out, they starved people, they moved people in. Who do they move in? Russians. The same thing happened in several other regions, Lithuania, Estonia, so-called captive nations, Latvia. People moved out, Russians put in. This way, you achieve a Russian majority where one didn't exist previously. At the heart of the Ukrainian effort was the famine. I should also point out, just in passing, that the famine was not restricted to Ukraine. An estimated 7.5 million Russians, Soviet citizens, died between 1931 and 1933 as a result of famine produced when the Soviets decided they were going to force people onto collective farms. But the largest percentage of them, perhaps 80%, were Ukrainian. By 1933, Ukrainians were dying at an estimated 30,000 people a day. A third of them were children under age 10. In all, as I said, 5 to 5.5 million Ukrainians died. As they did so, Joseph Stalin denied to the world that a famine was taking place. He said there is no problem with hunger in Ukraine, there's no problem with hunger in the Soviet Union. Just to divert from the topic a little bit here, because I'm a former journalist and I like to look at journalistic performance during things like this. Remarkably, Stalin got away with his lie for years. And in this, he was abetted by journalists from Western Europe and the United States. I think the chief abettor, the person who basically spread the lie about there being no hunger in Ukraine, was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, a man named Walter Duranty, who won a Pulitzer Prize in 1932 for his coverage of Russia, in which he denied. He said, there is no famine or actual starvation, nor is there likely to be. He wrote these words even as he was privately telling journalist friends in England that the famine was real. And his visitors who were able to slip into Ukraine saw firsthand the pain of the famine. All of this has led more recently to demands that the Pulitzer Prize Committee rescind Duranty's Pulitzer Prize posthumously. In the aftermath of the famine, after the mass deportations and deaths of the Ukrainian population, Stalin completed the exercise in a way that virtually assured that something like the current crisis eventually will unfold. As I said, to replace the decimated Ukrainian population, the central government imported several 100,000 Russians, changing the ethnic composition of what would, after the fall of the Soviet Union, become the nation of Ukraine. Okay. I should also point out that during the period immediately following World War II, the Russians, the Soviets, did the same thing with the region of Crimea. They did is they removed the Muslim Tatar population, relocated them out in the boondocks, and moved in ethnic Russians, which is why Crimea is so heavily Russian now, and why eastern Ukraine is extensively Russian as well, because they move people out and they move people in. Over the past several weeks, as I said, these threads have come together at one time. The dispossession and death of the Ukrainian and Tatar populations, their replacement by people who were Russian by ethnicity or language, have allowed the Russian nation under Vladimir Putin, the latest dictator, to move to Crimea, to annex it first by force, and then by an absurdly and transparently fraudulent referendum vote. Now the pressure is on in eastern Ukraine, where ethnic Russians have challenged the authority of the Ukrainian government as well, seizing government buildings. It's interesting that during World War II, Ukraine found itself in a very unusual situation. The Germans invaded, the Soviets were there, the Soviets were pushed back, the Soviets then counterattacked, and in the kind of the middle were the people of Ukraine, because they had no love of the Soviet government, and they really didn't have any love of the Germans. So what you have in Ukraine is some people during World War II siding with the Germans, in effect, and this leads to the accusation by the Central Russian government today that the government of Ukraine is in the control of fascists. There were others who sided with the Soviets. And then there was a very large group of resistance fighters who fought both sides. And they went, their goal was basically an independent Ukraine, which they got, at least briefly. I think it's clear to me, and I think most observers would agree, that this is part of Russia's ongoing effort to expand its control in Eastern Europe under the guise of protecting the Russians living in the independent nations that used to be part of the Soviet Union. I think you're going to see similar pressure applied in such nations as Latvia and Estonia to other areas that were ceded by enforced Russian migration when ethnic local populations were displaced. If there's any hopeful sign these days, the media of the West don't seem to be buying the stories. The line coming out of Russia about the fascist enemy in Ukraine and the need to protect Russians who were under no threat, very little threat, immediate or long term. There seem to be very few, if any, Walter Durantys out there just now. The problem is that journalists can't stop Putin from doing anything. That's the job of other governments in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and I hope our other panelists will explore options that seem to grow smaller day by day. So, thank you.
Our third panelist is Dr. Rafaele Fierro, Associate Professor of History and the Program Coordinator of our General Studies program. He is going to present, and the geography students should take note of this title, Centripetal Forces and Centrifugal Forces, the Role of Nationalism in the Ukraine Crisis.
That title, I don't even know what that means.
Let me tell you.
Great, thank you, Fran. Appreciate it. Good morning. Well, what I want to talk about is bringing the situation up to its more modern climate. Bob touched on some of the historical roots going back to Stalin. I want to talk a little bit about the history too, but to bring it up to at least the end of the 20th century and now the 21st century, it seems to me that Ukraine's national identity has been shaped by historical realities that go back centuries, of course, and it's a boundary line that's been determined and shaped by autocrats more than anything else, and it's a rather sad imposition on a group of people who are, as Smith said, they're being played around like a football, and that's kind of the tragic part of it. But this goes back to Catherine the Great, who annexed the land from the Ottoman Empire way back in the 17th, 18th century, and then by Stalin, who, as Professor Brown said, killed off millions of Ukrainians in that region in 1932 and 33. And so for me, Putin is kind of the heir apparent to these autocrats of the past. I think more than one political commentator has referred to Putin as Stalin's spawn, which not only is alliterative, but it does make sense to me. He's trying to establish a more indirect way of continuing that idea of empire. And in some ways this crisis is based on a clash of ideologies between the more democratic-leaning West and the autocratic East and Russia. Just briefly, Catherine the Great, even though she kind of portrayed herself to the West as an enlightened despot who respected the rule of the law, she went to war with the Ottomans and grabbed that land, which would ultimately be part of modern Ukraine. And there she essentially imposed serfdom on her new subjects. Stalin, we heard a good deal about him, forced famine to deny Ukraine independence. Millions were killed by him. An estimated 25% of that population was wiped out. So you had millions of Ukrainians living there who were eliminated, and then Russians were brought in to change literally the map of Ukraine. And so it's kind of interesting, you hear Putin talk about how a majority of citizens live in the eastern and southern portion of Ukraine. That's because of the history that I've just described. In many ways, it's kind of an imagined community that Putin sees in that part of Ukraine. Now that brings us to Putin himself. First of all, he called the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and this is directly coming from him, the single biggest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So you can kind of see where his mindset is. He sees this vision of reinstalling the Soviet Empire, at least on some level. You can see from this slide here that these are the former boundaries of the Soviet Union, with a host of different types of people controlled by the Soviet Empire on the eastern side. Ukraine is simply one of many dozens of people that the Soviet Union controlled, and I think that's the vision that Putin sees for the future. I found an interesting quotation from Putin to George W. Bush in 2008. He said, "You have to understand, George," they were on a first name basis, "Ukraine is not even a country." And so you can see where Putin is coming from. In effect, he's exploiting the basic problem many nation states face today, especially in that part of the world. There are many ethnic groups that are packed into these somewhat superficial national boundaries, and sometimes those lines are not conveniently drawn, and that that poses an opportunity for someone like Putin to take advantage of these superficially constructed lines. So he is indeed taking advantage of the divisions within the Ukraine. I think Professor Smith mentioned very well that, you know, this dichotomy between East and West is sort of a false dichotomy. It's an oversimplification of what's actually happening on the ground, and he can attest to that better than I can. But there are many differences in ethnicity and language, and Putin, I think, is exploiting that and exacerbating the tensions. You can see, I think this was a map that we saw earlier, but in the eastern and southern part of Ukraine, you have a substantial portion of the population considering themselves Russian, and the further west you go, the more they identify themselves as Ukrainians. And so that's the situation that Putin is taking advantage of. To what extent the people there on the eastern side affiliate with Russia and want to belong to some sort of Russian empire, hard to tell. I'm sure there's some sentiment toward that, but I think a lot of that is also Russian propaganda. So you can see that boundary line filled with these ethnic groups is superficially constructed, but it was also created that way by the past centuries that we've described. Here's another map that shows the differences in language. Again, further south and east you go, the more predominantly the people there speak Russian, although, again, there's a lot of overlap between Ukrainian and Russian. And one thing I found as well to kind of comport with what Robert was saying is that if you watch television in the Ukraine, half the programs are in Russian, half are in Ukrainian. So there's so much overlap, it's hard to tell the difference. But on a map like this, you can see that these divisions do matter, and autocrats like Putin can exploit them. You know, if you look at it from the Western Ukraine point of view, if you will, and there's one political activist who said the biggest problem we have today is the absence of the right message. In order to unify East and West, we need to be sending the right signal to the people in the East. He, in fact, went so far as to say that this is not a Putin problem, but it's a failure to communicate the message that binds East and West together. Now, what that message is, I would suspect would have to do with developing closer ties with the European Union and perhaps creating a greater push toward democracy. The Ukraine has tried to develop this common vision, but I think that Putin has kind of gotten in the way of that, and that's what's exacerbated the tensions. But again, I would argue like as if Putin was acting like an heir of Catherine the Great and Joseph Stalin. His approval rating, once he grabbed the Crimea, reached something like 76%, which is an age-old tactic of autocrats like Putin. They don't want to focus on the economic problems that their countries are having. Instead, they create this almost false sense of nationalism by stirring people's emotions up and thereby making them forget about the very real problems they face at home. So he's using the same tactics that autocrats of the past have used. So it's much easier to do that than to solve Russia's very real economic problems. Political commentator, reporter for the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, he said that Putin is focused more on building the power of his state and not on the prosperity of his people. And I think that tends to be true. He's taking advantage of these rather hastily drawn boundary lines that places a majority of Russians in countries like the Ukraine. But if you expand the map a bit more, you can see this. But if you look at the broader area here, there are other countries in which there are a substantial number of Russians. And so if you use this logic, then he would have by right the will and the ability to go into these other places like Estonia, for example. Latvia, 26.2% of Latvians are Russian. So I suppose he would have the right to go in and rescue the Russians from Latvian control. In Kazakhstan, 23.7% of people there are Russian. So if you use Putin's logic and you take it to the extreme, I suppose he'd be justified in taking over New York City because of Russian Jews who live there. He would rescue them from the New York City government. If you look at it from another point of view, autocrats believe more in power politics than the rule of law, which kind of reminds us of Catherine the Great once again. If you look at the next map, this is the ethnic divisions within Russia. There are 185 ethnic groups inside of Russia. Now, good luck trying to draw boundary lines based on those ethnic groups. And, you know, if, again, we take Putin's logic, each one of those groups would have the right to claim independence. Some, in fact, have attempted to do so, simply because they constitute a majority of their respective ethnic group within their region, within their area. In fact, someone like Putin would be the first to crack down on that kind of behavior within Russia. So it seems to me that the best thing for the Ukraine and the Western powers that support it would be to encourage Ukrainians into the European Union, into the fold of the West, and trying to convince Putin, which is a very difficult task, that is pretty much a done deal. At some point, there's going to be this effort, as we've seen already, for the Ukraine to be welcomed into the League of European Nations. In this sense, the Ukraine reminds me of some of the democratic revolutions that have been impacting other parts of the world, like Egypt and Tunisia. There's a wave of democratic sentiment that has been spreading across the globe, and I do see Ukraine in some sense as part of that broader movement. And I think Putin, being the autocrat that he is, he's desperately trying to stop this from happening. I think he would be better served to bring Russia into the EU than to keep the Ukraine out of it. Given who he is, it's not likely to happen anytime soon. One thing that we haven't mentioned yet is that on May 25th, the Ukrainians will hold presidential elections to determine the fate of their country. It is important that these elections be legitimate without outside interference. I'm very skeptical that that will happen. Putin's role in the Ukraine thus far has been very indirect. He's claiming that he has no real power in the eastern part of the country, that these are kind of grassroots movements that are springing up on the part of the Russian people there who are claiming independence from the Ukraine. They want to be brought into the Russian fold. But to me, it seems that the solution is to have the Ukraine conform to Western ideology rather than to going back to the age-old autocratic nature of the East. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Milewski, instructor of business, and also possessor of a graduate degree in Russian history, unless you are curious about that, will give our penultimate presentation. I like to use that word. It just sounds impressive. Neither West nor East, the influences of Russian culture and history on the Ukraine crisis.
Ukraine is doomed. The West will not come to its aid in any meaningful way. At the least, Ukraine will be partitioned with puppet regimes subservient to Russia in the East. At the most, it will be invaded by Russia, and Russian military forces will drive all the way to the Polish border. Why am I so pessimistic? Because I study Russian history and I know Polish history. I will try to explain what is happening in Ukraine today by looking at Russian and indirectly Polish history. I'm going to share a personal story which will help illuminate how Russian realpolitik works. At 4 a.m. on February 10, 1940, in eastern Poland during World War II, a knock came on the door of my father's house. He was 9 years old, living with his mother and older brother and sister. His father was away, serving with the Polish army. It was Russian soldiers and the local communist committee at the door. They told my father and his family they had 1 hour to pack. They would not be returning. They were put on a freight train to Siberia, where they almost died. When they arrived there, they were greeted by tired and weak Ukrainians who had been deported there about 10 years earlier. 1 million Poles had been forcibly removed from their homes and deported to make room for the shifting westward of the border that Stalin was planning. When Germany started World War II by invading Poland on September 1st, 1939, what few remember is that the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east 2 weeks later. This was part of the secret agreement between Stalin and Hitler to divide Poland and share its spoils. I quote from this book, The Polish Deportees of World War II. According to Stalin, the joint aim of the Soviet Union and Germany was, quote, to restore peace and order in Poland, which had been destroyed by the disintegration of the Polish state, and to help the Polish people establish new conditions for its political life, end quote. What was the result of that restoring of peace and order? Soviet domination of Poland for the next 45 years after World War II, and also for East Germany, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Hungary, and all the countries stuck behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. When Russia wants something, it takes it. I'm about to present an argument. I'm referring my remarks to the Russian leadership. I'm not talking about the Russian people, for whom I have the greatest compassion. I welcome you to agree or disagree with my remarks. The single defining event in Russian history is its conquest by the Mongol horde in the 1200s and its subjugation by the Mongols for the next 200 years. During this time, the Mongols would arrive annually, demanding a very high tribute payment. If the village paid it, the Mongols would go away for another year. If the village didn't, the result was rape, pillage, torture, and probably the burning of the village and the killing of everyone in it. The village leaders who oppressed their people in order to save them ultimately became personally rich, threw off Mongol domination, became Russian princes, and ultimately the Russian Tsar, a dictator, came from this group. The Russian state was not born out of Enlightenment principles of freedom, democracy, self-determination, and the pursuit of happiness as in the United States. From the Mongol experience and other experiences to come, Russian leaders learned to fear foreigners, fear weakness, value strength, value power, value service to the state, and value the domination of all individuals to the service of the state. This was true for the Tsar, for the Communist Politburo, and for Putin today. Putin is not interested in the Western system of free market economics and democracy. Putin wants a strong Russian state protected from the outside world. This means a sphere of influence between Russia and its neighbors controlled by Moscow. It is very much an empire mentality. At the least, this sphere of influence includes Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. At the most, it will also include Estonia, Latvia, maybe Lithuania and Moldova, and probably Transnistria, or a variety of parts of the above. The protests and violence in Ukraine today are being led by Russian intelligence and military forces. Their aim is to create turmoil and to establish Russian-friendly puppet regimes there. The reason the Russians are taking over government buildings is so that fake elections can be held and puppets put into power. Ukraine may remain, but its independence from Russia, at least in the east of the country, is over. A new Cold War is upon us. A new Iron Curtain will be drawn. Unfortunately, Ukraine will be behind this curtain, as the new border will be along the Polish, Slovakian, Hungarian, and Romanian borders. What must the West do? Russia only understands power. NATO's footprint must be increased significantly, with permanent NATO troop deployments in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. This is to prevent Russian meddling in these countries as it is meddling in Ukraine today. Short term, Putin will remain in power, and his grip will be tight on Ukraine and the other countries I mentioned. These empire expansions are to distract the Russian people from their own economic hardship and political repression, and to theoretically keep Russia safe. The call to nationalism is made easier by the fact that in Russia today there is no freedom of the press, no free speech, no free political system, and no free legal system. The economy is directed by the Kremlin and run by a handful of billionaires, the so-called oligarchs, all close friends of Vladimir Putin. The only truly efficient government institution in Russia today is the intelligence agencies, which has been true throughout Russian history. Long term, the Russian people will tire of the repression, corruption, and inequality as they did during the Russian Revolution and at the end of the Cold War. This system will collapse or be overthrown, and the potential for reform will be at hand. But that will not occur in Putin's lifetime. Ultimately, this is a long-term struggle between two different value systems. Democracy will ultimately prevail, but sadly, not today for Ukraine.
And last but certainly not least, Professor Blaszczynski, who's Professor of Business and Economics and the CIS Program Coordinator, will present Russia, the last European colonial empire.
I wish to look at the Ukrainian crisis in the context of American international relations, statecraft. There seems to be consensus in the U.S. that there is nothing we can do to stop Putin's game plan in Ukraine, and that we probably couldn't have done anything to prevent this crisis. I will argue that these positions are erroneous, naive, misguided, and ultimately dangerous. So first, could we have done anything to prevent this crisis? Well, I'm convinced that we could have. But before I list the numerous policy mistakes of the Obama administration, which, through projecting weakness and indecision, have emboldened Putin and other nasty actors around the world, I want to make it clear that the roots of our weakness reaches way before Barack Obama's election. Extreme naivete seems to be a common affliction among American presidents. Witness Jimmy Carter's surprise at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, George W. Bush's peering into Vladimir Putin's soul, and of course, President Obama's and Hillary Clinton's famous reset button. The point is that American presidents lack any basis in their experience to imagine the mindset of a KGB officer or a mass murderer on the scale of Stalin. Consequently, our leaders often assume they can contain the beast through international agreements and institutions or charm offensives and appeasement. Indeed, from Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations to FDR's United Nations to both the Bushes and Barack Obama, the invocation of international law is one of the most recurrent themes in American foreign policy. Of course, the problem is there is no such thing as international law except in the form of international agreements and treaties between sovereign states. And without some means of enforcing these agreements, they are not worth the paper on which they're written. In some cases, the enforcement derives from the loss of benefits that a treaty brings to its signatories, as in a trade agreement. Otherwise, however, for international agreements to have any semblance of law requires a policing force. Our presidents invariably call upon the mythical international community as if expecting such a force to to magically appear. But in the post-World War II era, the only force by default has been the United States and its economic and military power. If we want international law to have any meaning, we must act ourselves when it is flagrantly violated. If a Saddam Hussein signs an armistice agreement, we cannot allow him to keep violating this agreement with impunity. If we do allow it, then of course armistice agreements become meaningless and it becomes more difficult to end wars. Unfortunately, George Bush Sr. did allow Hussein to grossly violate the agreement before the ink was dry. This should have been the major justification for the second Iraq War. But, of course, the mistake that G.W. Bush made was much worse in that he almost lost the war. There's nothing worse than going to war and losing it. To be fair to G.W., of course, his father had a much larger military he inherited from Ronald Reagan. Sorry, I lost here. Here we go. In the first Gulf War, we were able to field an army of 500,000 troops. By contrast, G.W. inherited a drastically reduced military from Bill Clinton. What has to, however, be emphasized through all of this is that whatever or whether the United States acts or fails to act decisively has a huge impact throughout the whole world. When we decided to invade Iraq because of its purported weapons of mass destruction, Libya's Gaddafi offered to give up his nuclear weapons program, a program that we weren't even aware of, okay, that he had. And of course the Iranians voluntarily suspended their nuclear program. But once it became obvious that we were bogged down and in danger of losing the war, well, all these good effects went away and all the bad actors were again emboldened. And one of these, of course, was Vladimir Putin, who correctly perceived our troubles in Iraq as an opportune time to invade Georgia. Indeed, G.W. Bush felt constrained by the loss of political capital as a result of his almost losing the war in Iraq and, of course, having our forces stretched rather thinly in both Iraq and Afghanistan to mount any kind of a posture against Putin. Of course, President Obama compounded this mistake by totally ignoring Russian aggression in Georgia and offering up his reset policy, the centerpiece of which was the appeasement of Russian sensibilities by canceling the missile defense system to be installed in Poland and the Czech Republic. To those who have close experience with Russian sensibilities, it was obvious why the Russians objected to a system that was ostensibly aimed at protecting against a rogue Iranian regime. If installed in Central Europe, the system would also be a potential defense against Russian intermediate nuclear missiles. Russia threatened that if the missile defense system were installed, they would pull out of the intermediate nuclear missile treaty. However, in spite of the cancellation of the system, the Russians still insisted on exempting the intermediate missiles from the latest nuclear treaty. Of course, our administration accepted their reasoning without question, I guess. The point is that absent President Obama's reset policy, Europe would today have a fully functional missile defense system. And the fact is that in addition to Europe's dependence on Russian natural gas, it also has to worry about the Russian nuclear missile threat. Another theme American presidents seem to favor is the justification for action is moral outrage at genocide, mass murder, and human rights violations. President Clinton used this to justify intervention in the Balkans, and President Obama made a passionate case for intervening in Libya in order to prevent the slaughter of thousands in the city of Benghazi. However, again, this moral stance was rather selective or eclectic. Clinton was not moved to intervene in Rwanda, and Barack Obama seems oblivious to over 150,000 dead in Syria. Worse, President Obama's famous red line over the use of or movement of chemical weapons turned into a disaster as his bluff was called. It is hard to imagine a worse outcome in terms of emboldening the nasty characters of this world. But it did get worse, as our president allowed himself to be played for a fool by Putin, who lent a helping hand in arranging an agreement between the U.S. and Syria's Assad. This agreement ensured U.S. acquiescence to Assad staying in power for at least as long as it took to dispose of the listed chemical weapons. It also allowed Assad to use chemical weapons that were not listed. And it made Russia the executor of the whole agreement. Tens of thousands of dead Syrians later, Assad is using chlorine gas, made famous in World War I, to kill civilians. He is far behind schedule in turning over the listed chemical weapons, and we have to plead with Putin to help enforce the agreement, while at the same time we want to impose sanctions on him for his behavior in Ukraine. Yet another aspect of this moral outrage-based U.S. military interventions of President Clinton and Obama is their insistence on forswearing boots on the ground. My God, we can't have that. And relying purely on air power. This policy presents several problems. For one, announcing at the outset that the enemy need not worry about facing U.S. troops on their doorstep tends to extend the length of the conflict. I'm convinced that absent this foolish assurance, Gaddafi would have left his post a lot sooner, saving considerable Libyan lives. Secondly, having issued this assurance to the American public makes it difficult then to follow up with boots on the ground that are necessary to help stand up a local government and, of course, establish its authority, as in Libya. To a KGB officer like Putin, President Barack Obama's performance on numerous other situations also indicates weakness and ineptitude. Sending Vice President Biden, whose favorite Iraq policy recommendation was to partition the country, to negotiate the status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government. Well, that was an expression of the president's desire to pull out of Iraq at any cost. And indeed, he managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. It might have been very useful today to have some forces in Iraq that might perhaps be placed on the border with Syria. Not to mention the possibility of discouraging Iran from using Iraqi airspace to send aid and fighters to help Assad. The decision to order a surge in Afghanistan and announcing at the same time with the withdrawal date was the height of folly. It assures defeat as friend and foe alike realize that allying with the American forces leads to a lifespan no longer than the withdrawal date. Should we be surprised that Afghans and Pakistanis seem not to care about our wishes or what we want them to do? And the picture of the President and White House officials blabbing operational details in order to brag about getting bin Laden also does not inspire confidence in the competence of the President. Then there is the case of the opportunity to make a strong case to the UN for added sanctions against Iran when its secret nuclear facility became public. The leaders of France and Britain were anxious to take advantage of the political moment, but Barack Obama postponed this action for the sake of a photo op of him chairing a meeting of the United Nations Security Council, passing an utterly superfluous resolution on non-proliferation. Now, when we're facing growing challenges from Russia and China and a resurgent Al-Qaeda, we are reducing our armed forces further. The trouble is that even with technological superiority and superior training, we will not be able to mount a surge like the one that turned around the war in Iraq. This cannot but help but embolden our adversaries. Now, numbers of troops does matter. The upshot is that we have been projecting greater and greater weakness and inability to fashion and carry through on a strategy or even a set of principles that our allies in the world can trust us to uphold and our adversaries to respect. This brings me to the Ukrainian crisis. The President's reaction to the Ukrainian crisis is tantamount to an invitation to Putin to do as he pleases. Firstly, our President assured Putin that no matter what he does in Ukraine, we will not respond militarily. Of course, we may not be able to do much militarily, but announcing that we will not even try under any circumstances speaks plainly that we just don't care. Just in case Putin didn't get that message, Obama turned down the Ukrainian request for weapons, offering food rations instead. We wouldn't even share our intelligence with the Ukrainians, so if Russia were to mount an invasion, we wouldn't tell them which direction they're coming from. Again, the message could not be clearer, as we will not even lift a finger to help Ukrainians defend themselves. In other words, contrary to our President's heroic speechifying, our actions are telling Putin to go ahead and do whatever the hell he pleases in Ukraine. And now that we're sanctioning individuals as President Obama, now we are sanctioning individuals in Russia as President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry insist this is not personal. So it's not really aimed at Putin. So what should we have done and what can we do now? Well, when Putin was moving his forces into Crimea, we should have issued a much more stern warning privately than our public protests. Perhaps our president did so, but I wouldn't bet on it, since he prefers to conduct his diplomacy on TV. Upon Russia's annexation of Crimea, we should have erred on the side of overreaction to send as clear a signal as possible. The president should have announced several steps, including ordering significant U.S. naval presence in the Black Sea, not just one little ship, announcing an immediate review of the policy decision to cancel the missile defense system in Central Europe, and announce steps to increase the U.S. ability to increase production and export of natural gas. These measures would at least get Putin's attention without increasing the risk of actual military confrontation, at least not immediately. Because these are things that Putin actually cares about. While it might not have caused the Russians to withdraw from Crimea, it certainly would have given them pause about continuing the incursions into Ukraine. Of course, we also should have said yes to the Ukrainian request for weapons and, without fanfare, offered to deliver anti-tank and shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. That too would give Putin pause. Under no circumstances should we ever agree to abridge Ukrainian sovereignty by promising the Russians that Ukraine will never be admitted to NATO or the EU. That's something that we did once before when we asked the Russians to acquiesce to the unification of Germany. We promised, in fact, that NATO wouldn't be expanded to Poland and Central Europe. That, by the way, is a violation of our own principles of international law, supposedly, and other principles. We should also engage in the propaganda war and broadcast over all media evidence that contradicts Russian claims about the Kiev government, as well as pictures of the Russian special forces operating in Ukraine, popularly known as the Little Green Men, or for those who understand Soviet history, the unknown assailants or unknown perpetrators. We should point out that Russia is acting illegally by violating the Budapest Agreement, in which Russia promised to uphold Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. These are steps we actually can and should implement even now. Making life difficult for some of Putin's elite friends adds a nice touch, but expecting this to alter the course of history is a pipe dream. In fact, economic sanctions in general are not likely to be very effective and thus should be avoided. President Obama made a big deal of the decline in the Russian ruble and the stock market, but both have since stabilized and even bounced back as people realize that the small ball reaction by Barack Obama. More importantly, the Russian economy was already in a downward glide path, so imposing economic sanctions actually would help Putin to do him a favor by giving him a convenient excuse to blame for a lousy economy, which was coming anyway. And we should not underestimate the Russian nation's capacity for suffering economic misery for the sake of empire and Mother Russia. Everyone seems impressed by our payment system sanctions against Iran and North Korea, bringing both to the negotiating table. But these sanctions are not likely to be effective or as effective in the case of Russia. Russia will be better able to substitute other modes of payment in their trade. And we should keep in mind that using such sanctions ultimately undermines the role of the dollar and our banks in international trade and finance. There's a cost to us. One thing more, the actions I outlined above do not depend on support of our European allies, but rather promises to strengthen their independence down the road. Calibrating our policies to the least common denominator of our allies is a terribly foolish approach, especially if we recognize that Europe is not only dependent on Russian energy supplies, but also threatened by Russian nuclear missiles. What is at stake? Or in other words, what difference does it make? President Obama, in reacting to the Russian annexation of Crimea, said that the Russian behavior does not comport with 21st century norms of international relations, and also that we don't want to restart the Cold War. The problem is, not only is the 20th century Cold War back on, but it is also the 19th century European imperialism. Cold War will not end until the Russian people give up their dreams of empire, or the government gives up nuclear weapons. And Putin is determined to restore the last European colonial empire. The question that is in the balance is whether this is the world we want for our children. For if we don't check Putin in Ukraine, he will not stop there. He will calculate that in our current weakness and lack of resolute leadership, this is the chance to challenge and finally undermine, and fatally undermine, NATO. Remember that the Russian parliament has enunciated the principle of Russian defense policy encompassing protecting ethnically Russian populations in other countries. And that there are large Russian minorities in Latvia and Estonia. Of course, how they got there was through ethnic cleansing of the Ukrainian, of the Estonians and Latvians out of their own country. Both of these countries are NATO members. Should the Russians challenge this and cause trouble in these countries, of course, NATO will fall apart. Because in fact, ask yourself, will President Obama risk nuclear confrontation over Estonia or Latvia? Is President Obama going to educate people why Estonia matters? We certainly, he's afraid to make that case for Ukraine, so what the heck. We certainly do not want to get into a shooting war with Russia, which is, after all, nuclear power. But at the same time, we should not kid ourselves that Ukraine isn't important. And we should recognize that the Russians, too, might wish to avoid a shooting war with us. In other words, just because we don't want a military confrontation does not mean we should roll over and play dead. Not to dredge up the Cold War, but mutual assured destruction was based on both countries believing the other would counterattack. But even before the Cold War, the balance of power doctrine that kept the peace, Bismarck's day, and other periods in history, was also based on countries believing that their adversaries were able and willing to fight. We do not want to escalate the threats and concentrate threats to move us to the precipice of war. Instead, we should issue threats that are clear enough and significant enough and believable and to be an effective deterrent. We should take care that our communications are not misunderstood, that we always offer alternatives and avoid publicly humiliating our adversaries, carefully choosing what to communicate publicly and what to keep private. That's a distinction that our president doesn't seem to understand. And above all, we must never issue empty threats. The problem Obama faces is that after Syria and Iran, no one believes he is willing to carry through on his threats. And thus there is a great risk that his bluff might be called, at which point we either have to make good on the threat or lose all credibility with any influence to influence events anywhere else. At this point, actions will speak, and we should choose these actions carefully.
That some of you will have to go 20 after, but we still have about 15 minutes, and the questions may continue after 20 after, so if you can stay, by all means, please stay. So at this time, if you do have any questions or comments, I would ask that you stand up, or if you're not comfortable standing, at least try to speak kind of loudly, because we don't have a mic for you.
I just have a comment. I mean, it's a great lecture in the sense of it's a great historical background, but I think you're missing on what really is going on, like people are dying and there's 100 people dead then and then 30 people dead this day and then 1,000 missing. And you're not showing, I think, the picture of what's going on there. I mean, in the beginning, the pictures were great, the Maidan and all of that stuff, but you're not showing, I mean, it's a great, again, historical background information, but I think we have to, well, since we're younger kids and we're like in this generation, I understand like back then it was important to see the steps that Russia is going to do towards Ukraine and what exactly it's trying to do, but it has to be kind of like more information on what's happening over there and why is it happening over there and why exactly Putin is trying to do at this moment. Like, I forgot your name, but you mentioned right in the middle, right? Yeah. You mentioned about the journalists. Was that you? Yeah. How?
That was me.
No. That was
me.
Barbara.
Yes, that was me.
Yes. sorry, you said that back in Stalin, when Stalin was in power, there were journalists who were trying to hide the truth. About 24 hours ago, Putin gave, I guess, like, I don't know how to call this, but he like awarded, he awarded journalists who were working for the Russian TV for telling the truth on what's going on in Ukraine and everything. And I was like watching the news and I was like, you gotta be kidding me, because when the whole thing started, when Maidan started, well, my historical background,
I hate
I'm
to cut
from...
you short, but we do want to have time for other people. So if you have a question, if you could just state the question.
We'll address it.
Yeah, it's...
I would say, first of all, 5.5 million people dead. That's a pretty big number, and that's an historically larger number than what's happening in Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine right now is a tragedy and a disaster and a nightmare with the people who live there. But it's happening in sequences, and we don't have anything nearly proportional to what happened during the Great Famine in 1932 and 1933.
Very few people have died so far.
Yeah, there aren't millions of
No, I
Ukrainians like
understand,
dead in the
I
street.
completely get that, but
And then-
if you have a family
In
back...
case you missed it, we did say that Putin's a liar.
No, I don't disagree.
I think, let me suggest this. You can get images of what's happening in Ukraine, or reports on what happening in Ukraine. If you listen to one radio station, National Public Radio, you can get the day-to-day stuff that's happening there. That's where you can find it. The National Public Radio sends correspondents into the disputed areas. They do interviews with people living there. You can get the day-to-day, up-to-the-minute stuff there. And I think that's a good place to turn to.
And also, I think, the Walter Durantes of the world that Professor Brown mentioned, they're not relics of the past. I think there's this tendency in the West and in the United States for reporters to turn the other way today. And that's part of the problem. So, the propaganda you get from Putin, we would expect. You expect him to downplay the deaths that are happening now, which are tragic, so I agree with you. But when you hear Western reporters say that the conflict began when NATO forces moved slightly eastward, and that's what made Putin react to that, well, they're acting like Walter Durante did way back in the 1930s. They're turning a blind eye to Putin's aggression, and they're missing the historical analysis that we've tried to present today to give you some background information on who Putin is. And so even today, as we speak, one of the things that I've observed is that Western reporters, there's not a consensus that Putin needs to be stopped, that he's an aggressor, that in fact economic sanctions are too aggressive in some people's eyes. Even Thomas Friedman, the New York Times journalist, has said something like that. Be careful of economic sanctions. They may have a reverberating effect. And to some extent that's true, but there's this effort on the part of Western journalists to downplay what's happening there. So if I were you, I would be as outraged by that as I would with Putin's antics, which we would expect.
And I assume that anything that goes out over Russian television is accurate only to the extent that it reflects a reality that Putin wants to portray. Simply that. It's a state-run media, and he can pin medals on anybody who wants to.
Just a quick update. What I found interesting now are the uprisings that are happening in Odessa, which is now in western Ukraine, on the western side of the Dnieper River, whereas most of the uprisings were happening in the eastern part of the country. Now we have uprisings in Odessa, which is very close to Transnistria, which has 1,200 Russian troops in it, and is 30% Russian ethnicity. So I see, look what's happening. It's a circle is forming. So where will the next uprisings be? Will it be in Lviv or Kiev? He's 10 steps ahead of us in this chess game. And we're still talking about kind of escalating economic sanctions.
Other questions? I do have a mic I can Questions, comments? Way in the back.
I think I can pick. Andre, I wanted to just ask you and some of the others. I remember when we were here and talking about Syria and talking about what President Obama was trying to do, but that there was so much resistance within our own Congress and within our own government. So is that not a part of it too? The will of our own people, the will of our Congress to move as well?
Well, let's put it this way. The American public, like publics in most countries, Russia accepting, of course, generally does not want to go to war. So we're, I think, generally a peaceable people. But the problem is, it's the role of the president to lead on such issues, when in fact the perception is that it is something that is essential to our national defense, essential to our national interest. It is up to the president to make the case. Presidents in the past have, in fact, almost always, invariably, the public has moved to where the president was leading. This president hasn't led on any of those cases. He hasn't made a case for Afghanistan. He hasn't made a case for anything. He made one speech, a couple of speeches about Libya, and even that he was, So it's up to the president to bring the American public and explain to us, why it's important. And then we'll see if people change their minds. And in fact, the other thing is that, yes, if we go to war, we definitely ought to have a declaration of war in Congress. But that isn't what we're talking about.
It sort of pains me to agree partially with Andre, but I sort of do here, because as I read the Syria situation, for instance, Obama's big mistake was to say, we're going to take action, by God, or drawing a line in the sand, and then he let the Senate, the House of Representatives, the American people sort of cover it over. And I think that's the point at which you have to look at presidential leadership and say it didn't succeed in this case.
Just one more comment to that. I think that the Republicans in Congress, they are so focused on American domestic policy and Obamacare and all the weaknesses of that, and that commands the public's attention. And foreign policy is a tricky thing. It's not an issue until something happens, and by that time it's too late. And I think much of the criticism that you hear in this forum seems justified to me, but the American public has been distracted by events at home, which seem all the more immediate and important to us. But just because something is happening way over in the Ukraine, it doesn't mean it's not vital to our national interests. And Americans don't seem to get that sometimes. Neither does the president. So, I think we ought to be focused more on foreign policy as a nation. And to the extent that there is criticism of the president in Congress, Republicans need to remind the American people of that too, but they seem to be as absent as he is on American foreign policy.
In fact, let me make the case for Ukraine. I mean, this is really the test case. This, I think, is a watershed moment in history, okay? Depending on how Ukraine falls, we're either talking about the revival of Russian imperialism or European imperialism or that period, and then the Cold War. I mean, there's a lot at stake here. Ukraine is a pivotal country. And this issue, this crisis, is pivotal in the history of the world. And indeed, as far as I can see, the president has no clue.
Are we watching something like what happened with Hitler with Czechoslovakia?
That's exactly what we're talking about. Precisely. Yes. Yes, exactly right.
My question is to all you guys, do you think that the problem can be solved without warfare? Because statistically, the United States' attitude towards Russia has always been, give them an inch, they'll take a mile, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis with Kennedy's administration and Reagan's administration. When the United States usually steps up, Russia steps down. So do you think if that happened now, war could be averted and Russia would back off, or what?
Well, war has to be averted because we're talking about nuclear powers. And that, in fact, is the thing that will help us avert war. But once again, as I said, just because we don't want to get into a fighting war with Russia doesn't mean we have to roll over and play dead. There is a game to be played, and we can play it. We've done it in the past, and we should do it again. realize that the Cold War is indeed back on, and in fact act accordingly.
I also think that, I think there's this basic human tendency to think that, you know, it's called presentism, that our time is different than past historical times. And in fact, you know, this situation today could be the watershed moment that we're all seemingly unaware of, because we think our time is different. There's no reason that today won't be the beginning of the same thing that happened with Hitler's appeasement in the 1930s. What makes us different? Really nothing. It's the same kind of historical trends that seem to be happening. The problem is we don't see these things until we look at it retrospectively. And then we say, ah, that was the moment, that was important. And I think our leaders need to be wise enough to recognize that these presentist arguments, they don't work, and they're very dangerous. So, you know, as far as military force is concerned, Russian historians and experts know better than I, but it seems to me that you need to respond at least with a threat of force. And if you do that, then maybe, as you say, Russia will back down somewhat. But without that threat, then that's Putin's backyard.
Yeah, it would be nice to think that that we can find the correct blend of sanctions that might do something to cause Putin to pause. And I'm not sure quite what they would be, but I will offer an example from history. Yeah, Professor Blaszczynski described President Jimmy Carter's naivete when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Oh my God, whoever knew they would do that? Well, he should have known. It's simple enough to do. But in the aftermath, I can remember this vividly at the time, the United States government did muster a response, and it was mocked widely. What we did is we decided to boycott the Moscow Olympics in 1980. Yeah, that really hurt the Russians. They went ahead and had Olympics without us and most of the rest of the world. But then we cut off the sale of grain from the United States to the Soviet Union. And that was, the comments at the time were great. You know, Soviets invade Afghanistan, and what do? We punish our athletes and our farmers. But in point of fact, it's the boycott of grain sales, the embargo of grain sales that ultimately was one of the 2 or 3 pivotal factors leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union, because they couldn't feed their own people. And if they couldn't get the food, and they're in a shooting war in Afghanistan, and they're not winning because we're providing weapons to the other side, then the Soviet Empire, just I think like the Russian Empire today, looks rather brittle. So you just got to find the right stuff to use to make them take notice.
Question back here.
I just want to know why Obama, if he's not taking such a strong point on this, why he still acknowledges Putin and shakes his hand, and what the background is on what could possibly be going on behind that. I don't understand why he'd be so friendly, even if he's not taking a position, what you think is behind that in some way.
I think that he's attempting to observe the niceties of foreign policy, of international relations. We're not in a shooting war with them. We do have to we do have business with them. As Andre pointed out, basically we got tricked into having the Russians negotiate the chemical weapons agreement and enforce it in Syria. We need them for that. You know, there are things that we need them for still. And I think it's purely a matter of self-interest. I don't think that he harbors any great love of either Russia or Putin, but yeah, we need each other in certain areas still. So,
Actually, I'd like to disagree a little bit. I do believe that, in fact, President Obama actually has his roots in the old left. And that old left always was, in fact, not only pro-Soviet, but pro-Russian. But that aside, when it comes to diplomacy, the thing is that, in fact, you have to, in fact, shake people's hands and you can smile at them at times and talk pleasantries. The only thing is, and this is what makes diplomacy such a difficult craft, you've got to keep in mind, you've got to remember who the hell you're dealing with. It's who's sitting across the table from you. It could be a mass murderer, or for that matter, somebody who personally kills people for fun. The point is, diplomacy means you still have to, in fact, deal with them. So that's just the nature of the craft.
I thought that was, Obama was the new left. He's the old left. But he's too young to be the old left. We're all here, but his mentors are.
Another question back here?
You're talking about the, just addressing Professor Andre, I guess, saying that Obama is being negligent and that his administration isn't really doing anything towards it. What about counsel from ambassadors or even any other dignitaries giving him advice? Is there any records on that, or anyone explaining the situation or giving advice even from the right or the left side?
Well, that's what gets me back to my original problem with Obama, and that is that he comes from the left, and that his advisors are even farther left than he is. So that's the advice he's getting. I mean, who's he getting advice from? I mean, come on. So, you know.
Russian stooges?
Yeah, I'm not Russian stooges, but you know, some pro-Russians.
Please.
Ask Valerie Jarrett.
Putin has been in power for quite a while. And this isn't the first move he's made to enlarge Russia. How is it that we seem to have slept through each of these moves, going far back beyond the current president?
It's called selective inattention.
Well, I think that's part of it, but I also think that, you know, when presidents don't lead well and they just respond to the sentiments of the American people, well, then you get the foreign policy we have. You know, all of this is happening on the heels of 2 wars. We've been at war for the better part of, what, 11, 12 years now. And so politicians assume that the American people are war-weary. The last thing we want to do is be provocative. And so as a result, I think the pendulum has swung way in the other direction toward just not pressing too much, not having an aggressive foreign policy, and just kind of backing off from the world a bit. That's what I see. That's why we're so focused on domestic policy, on healthcare. And those things are important issues. But I think if we could just simply eliminate the last 11, 12 years of war, maybe we'd have a slightly different foreign policy. I think Andre would say no if you know, President Obama is still the president, it'd be the same thing. But I do think he's responding to the past decade or so.
But it isn't just Obama. I mean, and even when we do respond to things, to threats like Bush did, the problem is there's nothing worse than responding and screwing it up. So the problem is the incompetence of charge is not just leveled at Obama. We now have 16 years of presidents that have been incompetent as far as I'm concerned.
One or 2 more questions? Go ahead.
All right. I was going to direct it to Professor Brown, but whichever you guys can take this one. You guys been talking a lot about nationalism. I know he mentioned something about the Russian media. Obviously, they control everything, propaganda and all that. But I saw something in an NPR article I was reading the other day. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Russian word for it, but it was called they're calling it a punitive operation. What's basically coming out of Kiev back towards the Russians, like they're coming out of Kiev, they're calling it like an anti-terrorist thing, and then out of Russia, they're calling it except they call it a punitive operation. I don't know the Russian word, but they're saying that directly translated that they're basically calling them Nazis, which is something that I found to be something.
Well, yeah, that word Nazi and fascist is thrown around so much over there right now. They're both calling each other that. Why do the Russians consider the new government in Kiev to be fascists and Nazis? Well, again, it goes back to Maidan. Maidan was, it started off as a student protest, and then once it got rolling, and once the numbers of people there grew, it became, there were other groups that, anybody who had a beef with the government ended up joining in the fray, and one of the groups is called Pravi Sector. It's a paramilitary organization. They're sort of like the Ukrainian equivalent of the Tea Party in the U.S. More like those groups out west who run around with guns in the woods and have a very, very strong distrust of government in general, and so and they consider themselves a militia because what Yanukovych did, oh wow, you had it on the table, lovely. What Yanukovych did while he was president was weaken the military. He took all the funding that should have gone to the Ukrainian army and instead gave it to his relatives and friends, and at the same time strengthened what's called Berkut. It's the internal security service of the country, which has since been disbanded. And those were the police that were standing on Maidan confronting the protesters. And so after Yanukovych left, there was sort of this vacuum of power in Kiev. Most of the parliament was still there. The interim president and prime minister were appointed from amongst those parliament members who are still there. There's still a military presence in Kiev. These various groups are still there, and they're vowing to stay there as long as, just to make sure that they, whatever the new government decides, they don't revert to the same sort of policies that they were upset with in the first place. And so the Russians will use this, they call them banderites or banderovцы, and again that relates back to World War II, and this group of soldiers led by Stepan Bandera, who they were, as Professor Brown was commenting on that, they were sort of caught in the middle between Stalin and Hitler, and had to, they wanted neither of them, and so they ended up fighting against both of them, and so it relates back to things from World War II, and to answer your question, actually, is the Kiev government right now is considering what's going on in eastern Ukraine to be, they call it an anti-terrorist operation, because in their view, these groups who have taken the buildings in eastern Ukraine, and recently in Odessa there have been a few buildings taken over, they consider them terrorists. They consider them to be Russian agents that are there without uniform, special ops. They're called Spetsnaz of the Russian army, and so they consider an anti-terrorist organization to clear out these buildings. Whereas if they do take any sort of military action using the Ukrainian armed forces, Russia will then immediately say, "Oh, look, they're attacking these nice, peace-loving Ukrainian citizens who are occupying these buildings," and they'll consider it. They use the word punitive action to describe what's the fact that the Ukrainian government has the gumption to actually clear out its own government buildings of people who have stormed them and taken hostages and taken journalists hostage. So you have to be careful with the language. And you also have to be very careful which news agencies you are looking at. I've become, to get back to your point, a news junkie in the last couple of months because I'm so worried about what's going on over there. And you'll see, if you Google Ukraine news, you will see all the different news agencies, some from the United States, some from Russia. There's one called RT, which is an English language news agency run by the Kremlin. It's funded and run by Vladimir Putin. And they are putting their spin on things, just like Western media puts their spin on things. And so you have to be very careful with the language because there's a whole lot of clever turns of phrase, and different news agencies will be using two completely different terms to describe the same event.
I would say that both the Ukrainian media and the Russian media are wrong. I mean, these are little green men that are taking over these buildings, and in fact they are very often uniformed, except without insignia. Not only that, a lot of them are uniformly armed with the same equipment. It happens to be the same equipment as the Russian army uses. And so, I mean, they're little green men. They're not terrorists. They're just little green men.
There was some good quote. I can't find it. It might have been from the president of Latvia. His philosophy with little green men is if you kill the first little green man, no more come. So that's sort of, I got to find that quote again. It was a very interesting quote, but I'm not sure he's right about that. Another question or two?
I have one more.
Anybody else?
I just have a quick comment. When the
Please,
whole
and then we'll go back. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. When the whole propaganda started, you go in the Russian news, and remember when on Maidan there were more than 1 million people? When the more than 1 million people came on the streets of Kiev, you go on the Russian news and it says about less than 1,000 people came on the streets of Ukraine to protest.
Same when there's a protest in Washington.
Sounds like CNN.
Get different figures. So again, a lot of it's propaganda.
And it's not like it's 10,000 people, it's more than 1 million people on the streets, and then it's completely lies.
So it's always good to tap into multiple sources of news. That's always a good practice.
This is for Professor Blaszczynski, right? Is that how you pronounce it? Sorry. I know you advocate a lot for the United States to kind of play the world power. Because we kind of lack a world police, but is that really, what would be the best way to go about that? Because
Well, I think first of all, we have to have our leaders have a better understanding of the actors out there in the world, and that's a problem. So we probably ought to put our candidates for president, at least the ones that win the elections, through some kind of boot camp, where they learn how to influence, bad actors, In this case, when it comes to Putin, we got to figure out what it is that he really cares about. And you know what? It isn't the economy, and it isn't the finance even. Okay, this guy is out for power. He wants to be the next Russian Tsar. He wants to conquer territories. He wants to restore the Russian Empire. Well, then do stuff that he really cares about. Okay, take that away from him. So, for instance, putting the shield back in Europe, that would definitely have have an impact on his calculus, because he can no longer use those weapons, with impunity as, to threaten everybody else around, because at least there's a shield out there, okay? By the way, we also Obama also took away the shield in Alaska so that North Korea can threaten us. At this point, both shields would have been, in fact, operational. They're not. The other thing that, of course, Putin cares about is the oil, because that's the basis for his power. So if we have now the capacity to, in fact, feed Europe with our own oil, we can replace the Russian supplies. Are we doing that? Of course not. Should Obama just mention that possibility, he would take notice, because he cares about that.
Well, at this point, though, now that we pulled out of the shield, would it be even politically viable to renege on that, though? Would that Putin see that?
Renege on what? Putin's reneging on. Look, he's marching into Crimea. He reneged on the Budapest Agreement. Okay, where in fact, guess what? By the way, okay, talking about international law, we were signatories of that agreement as well. The agreement said that Russia and the United States and Great Britain, okay, committed themselves to guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in exchange for them giving up their nuclear weapons. Talk about, stopping proliferation of nuclear weapons. This was a major step. And the Ukrainians went along, and what did we do? So let's not worry about the niceties of, reneging on our commitment to the Russians.
All set? All right, I think we're going to call it a day. Thank you for coming.